Imagine this, you spend your entire life building something real. Decades of early mornings and late nights of sacrifice no one ever saw of staying when leaving would have been so much easier. You build a career, you build a home, you build a family. And then on the very night the world gathers to celebrate everything you have earned, the two people you trusted most sit across from you with a folder and a pen. Your daughter-in-law slides a nursing home placement form across the table. Warm smile never leaving her face, speaking in that careful, rehearsed voice about your future and your comfort and how much they care. And your own son, your own flesh and blood, claps his hands together like it is good news, like it is a gift. You do not scream. You do not cry. You pick up the pen, you sign your name on every single page, and then you look up and say quietly, the kind of quiet that fills a room and does not leave. You have no idea what you just did. They laughed it off. They thought they had won. What they did not know is that for 8 months before that night, while they were busy planning their next move, you had already made yours. What follows is not simply a story about betrayal. It is a story about a man who refused to be erased, who played the long game with patience and precision, and who proved that real power never needs to announce itself. Stay with this story until the very end, because what happens 3 months later will leave you breathless. And the moment they come crawling back will be one of the most deeply rewarding things you have ever witnessed. My name is Elliot Harmon. I am 65 years old, a structural engineer by trade and by nature, and for 40 years I built things meant to last: bridges, buildings, frameworks that held weight most people never thought about. I also built a life in Westfield, Ohio, in a colonial house on Deerfield Lane with a woman named Margaret who made every room feel like it was exactly the right size. She passed 2 years ago, and some mornings the house still surprised me with how quiet it had become. The morning of my retirement party, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror longer than usual. Not out of vanity, I had never been that kind of man, but because I was trying to take inventory of something I could not quite name. 40 years is a long time to do anything. I had worn the same kind of work boots for most of them. I had driven the same stretch of Route 30 to the firm so many times that my hands knew the turns before my eyes did. And now, on a Saturday morning in early October, with the backyard already set up, with folding chairs and a catered table my son Derek had insisted on, it was all finished. I looked at the photo of Margaret on the nightstand before I walked out of the bedroom. I did not say anything to it. I just looked. The party was nicer than I expected and louder than I preferred. 30 or so people filled the yard by noon, colleagues from the firm, a few neighbors, the couple from the church Margaret and I had attended for 20 years. Victor Calloway was there early, the way he always was, standing near the rose bushes with a cup of coffee and that expression he had worn since we were young men, the one that said he was watching everything and filing it away for later. Victor had been my closest friend for 4 decades. He was a retired attorney, and he had a gift for reading a room that I had always envied and occasionally feared. Derek and Cassandra were there, of course. My son was 38, broad-shouldered with a laugh that carried across a yard. He had always been good in a crowd. Cassandra, Cassie she preferred, stood beside him in a cream-colored blouse, gracious with every handshake, warm with every hug. She had been part of our family for 6 years, and she was skilled at the kind of warmth that felt genuine, until you noticed the slight delay before it arrived. I noticed it that afternoon. I had been noticing it for longer than I wanted to admit. I gave a short speech near the oak tree Margaret had planted in 1987. I thanked the firm, thanked my colleagues, said something honest about the privilege of work that mattered. People applauded and someone opened a second bottle of wine. I shook hands and accepted congratulations and tried to feel the full weight of the occasion, which was considerable. 40 years. I kept returning to that number the way you return to a word you cannot spell, not because you doubt it, but because it still surprises you every time. Somewhere around 3 in the afternoon, Victor appeared at my elbow. He steered me gently toward the far end of the yard, away from the noise, and he spoke quietly. He said he had been noticing some things about Derek lately. Not anything he could point to directly. More of a pattern, he said. A set of questions Derek had been asking people that did not quite add up to anything innocent. He said he wanted to talk to me properly soon, not at a party. I told him I appreciated it. I meant it. The guests began to drift away as the afternoon cooled. The catering crew folded the tables. The neighbors said their goodbyes one by one, until the yard held only family. Victor was gathering his jacket from the back of a chair when Cassie appeared beside him with that particular smile she used when she needed something to happen without appearing to ask for it. She said she hoped he would not mind giving them a little family time. Just the three of us. Victor paused. He looked at me across the yard, and in that look was something I recognized, a question he could not ask, and an answer neither of us was ready to give. Then he nodded, said his goodbyes, and walked around the side of the house toward his car. The yard went quiet. Derek sat down across from me at the patio table. Cassie reached into the bag she had set beside her chair and placed a manila folder on the table between us. Smooth and unhurried, the way you place something you have been carrying for a long time and are finally ready to set down. The folder had a logo on the front, Meadowbrook Gardens Independent Senior Living. Below the name, a small photograph of a building surrounded by trimmed hedges and a walking path that curved out of sight. It looked pleasant enough, the way a brochure always does, the way anything looks, when someone has spent money making sure you do not ask the wrong questions at first glance. Cassie opened it for me, which I noticed. She did not push it across and let me discover it on my own. She opened it herself and turned it to face me, already oriented, already organized, tabbed in 3 places with those little adhesive flags that come in office supply stores. Someone had spent time on this. Someone had done it more than once, probably revising it, adjusting it until it felt like the right version to present. She began to talk. Her voice had that quality it sometimes took on in serious conversations, measured and warm at the same time, the way a doctor speaks when delivering news they have delivered before. She said Meadowbrook was the finest facility in the county. She said I would have access to a full social calendar, organized activities, people my own age who shared my interests. She said the house was too large for one person, that rattling around in all that square footage alone was not living, it was just occupying space. She said they worried about me. She used the word safety twice in the same breath. I listened to all of it. I had spent 40 years in rooms where people presented plans they needed you to approve, and I had learned that the most important thing you can do in those moments is say nothing until you understand what is actually being asked of you. What was being asked of me was not a conversation. The tabbed flags told me that. The pre-opened folder told me that. This was a presentation, and the decision had already been made somewhere before this afternoon. In a room I had not been invited into, I looked at Derek. I do not know exactly what I was hoping to find in his face. Some hesitation, maybe. Some sign that he had argued against this before agreeing to be here, that he had pushed back at least once in whatever conversations had led to this folder appearing on my patio table on the evening of my retirement party. He was looking at me with something I can only describe as readiness. The look of a man braced for resistance he expected to manage. Then Cassie finished speaking, and the yard was quiet for a moment, and Derek brought his hands together in a single clap. Not enthusiastic, not cruel, just certain. The way you clap when something has been decided and you want the room to understand that you are in agreement. He smiled at me and said, "Dad, this is a great opportunity, come on." Just like that. Like the folder was a gift. Like the tabbed flags were a kindness. I have thought about that clap more than I care to admit. In the weeks that followed, I would hear it at odd moments in the quiet of the morning, in the space between sleeping and waking. It was not loud. It was not meant to wound. That was almost the worst part of it. It was the sound of my son telling me, without realizing he was telling me anything at all, exactly where I stood in his mind. Not at the center. Somewhere off to the side, a matter to be arranged. Cassie slid a pen across the table toward me. Black ballpoint uncapped, the cap placed neatly beside it. She had thought of everything. I sat with my hands in my lap for a long moment. I looked at the pen. I thought about Margaret, about the way she used to sit across from me at this same table on summer evenings, the two of us talking about nothing in particular. Her coffee going cold the way it always did because she talked too much and drank too slowly, and I loved that about her, every single time. I thought about the year Derek broke his arm, falling from the oak tree, and I sat on a plastic hospital chair for 6 hours because I could not bring myself to be anywhere else until I knew he was all right. I thought about what 40 years of work looked like when it was compressed into a manila folder with 3 adhesive flags. Then I picked up the pen. I signed every page. Slowly, steadily, the way I signed engineering documents with full attention with my name, exactly as it appears on my license, because I have always believed that if something is worth doing, it is worth doing correctly. I closed the folder. I pushed it back across the table to Cassie. I set the pen down beside it. I looked at her and then I looked at Derek and I said it quietly without heat, without anything in my voice that could be called anger. You have no idea what you just did. Derek laughed a little. The uncomfortable kind, the kind that fills silence when a person does not know what else to do with it. He said, "Dad, come on." He said it was a good thing. I stood up from the table. I walked across the patio and through the back door and into the kitchen. I stood at the counter for a moment in the quiet of that room in the house I had lived in for 31 years, looking out the window at the yard where my retirement party had been held just hours before. Then I took my phone from my pocket and scrolled to a number I had saved 8 months ago. Franklin Oaks answered on the second ring. I said, "Franklin, it's Elliot. I need you to proceed with everything we discussed." Franklin had been expecting that call. That is what I need you to understand before I explain anything else. When he picked up the phone that evening, he did not ask what I meant or what I needed or whether I was certain. He simply said he understood that everything was already in place and that I should come to his office in the morning. He said it the way a man speaks when a plan he has been holding in reserve is finally being set into motion, which is exactly what it was. 8 months earlier, I would not have known to make that call. 8 months earlier, I was still telling myself that what I was noticing was grief, making me suspicious that losing Margaret had left me with a heightened sensitivity to things that probably meant nothing. I gave that explanation a fair run. I held on to it for longer than I should have, because the alternative that my son and his wife were calculating the value of my life in columns and figures was not something a man accepts easily or quickly. The first thing I noticed was the questions. Not large questions, not the kind you can point to directly. Small ones inserted into ordinary conversations the way you insert a probe into a wall to check what is behind the surface. About 6 weeks after Margaret's funeral, Cassie asked me over Sunday dinner what typically happened to a family home when an older person eventually needed full-time care. She framed it as a general question, something she had been wondering about. She said a friend of hers had recently dealt with a similar situation and found the whole process confusing. I told her it depended on how the property was held and what estate documents were in place. She nodded and changed the subject. I did not change what I was thinking. Derek came separately a few weeks after that with a different angle. He suggested over the phone that I might want to consider simplifying my finances. He used that word specifically, simplifying. He said that managing multiple accounts and investment vehicles at my age was unnecessary complexity, that there were easier ways to structure things. He mentioned a financial advisor he knew. He offered to come with me to an appointment. I thanked him and said I would think about it. I did not go. The last thing, the one that settled it for me, happened on a Thursday afternoon when I came home earlier than expected from a walk and found Cassie in my study. She was at the filing cabinet in the corner, the one where I kept the household documents, insurance policies, the deed, Margaret's medical records from the last year of her life. She had the second drawer open. When she heard me come in, she straightened and smiled and said she had been looking for a pen and could not find one anywhere. There was a pen on my desk in the cup beside the telephone, exactly where it had always been. We both knew she could see it from where she was standing. I called Victor that same evening. I told him everything, laid it out in order the way he had always taught me to present facts without interpretation first, just the sequence. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he gave me the name Franklin Oaks and told me not to wait. Franklin was 55, precise in his thinking, and had the particular quality I most needed at that point, which was the ability to act without drama. Over the course of several meetings, he helped me do 4 things. The first was to transfer the house on Deerfield Lane into the Harmon Family Revocable Trust with myself as sole trustee, structured so that no one could sell, refinance, or encumber the property without my direct authorization. The second was to revise my will so that Derek's inheritance was reduced to the legal minimum the state of Ohio required, with the remainder directed to a scholarship fund at the local community college established in Margaret's name. The third was to open a separate account that Derek and Cassie had no knowledge of, where I quietly moved a portion of my liquid assets. The fourth thing, and this one was Victor's suggestion, strongly made, was to retain a small private audit firm to take a careful look at Derek's business finances. I did not enjoy doing that. It felt like something that should not be necessary between a father and his son. I did it anyway. The morning after the retirement party, I drove to Franklin's office. He had coffee waiting, which I appreciated. We sat across from each other and he confirmed that every document was properly filed, every transfer legally recorded, every provision exactly as we had written it. He asked me one question. He asked why I had signed the nursing home placement form when I had clearly had no intention of accepting the situation it represented. I told him the truth. I said I signed it because I wanted to see precisely what they would do next, now that they believed the board had been cleared. He looked at me for a moment and then wrote something on his notepad. I did not ask what it was. I told him my intention was to go to Meadowbrook to settle in without visible resistance, to give them the stage they had arranged and let them perform on it while I watched from the wings. A good engineer knows that the best way to understand where a structure is weakest is to let it bear weight. Franklin nodded slowly. Then he set down his pen and looked at me across the desk with an expression I had not seen on him before. He said, "Elliot, I have the results from the financial audit you requested. The one on Derek's business accounts." He said I needed to see what they had found before I made any further decisions. He said I should probably take a breath first. What Franklin showed me that morning took about 20 minutes to go through and about 20 days to fully absorb. I will not lay out every detail here because the full weight of it only became clear later after other pieces had fallen into place. What I will say is that when I walked out of his office and sat in my car in the parking lot, I stayed there for a while without starting the engine. Not because I was surprised. I am not certain I was surprised at all. But there is a difference between suspecting something and holding the documentation of it in your hands, and that difference is not a small one. 2 weeks passed. I spent them quietly saying nothing to Derek or Cassie beyond what was necessary, keeping my voice steady on the phone and my expression unchanged on the 2 occasions they came by the house. I had spent 40 years reading structural plans that other engineers had built their reputations on learning to see the flaws without announcing them, and I found that skill transferred reasonably well to other situations. Moving day arrived on a Tuesday in mid-October. I had decided early on that I would not take everything. There was no practical reason to fill a senior living apartment with 30 years of accumulated furniture and accumulated life. But there was also a deliberate quality to my choices that went beyond practicality. I took the photo albums from the hallway shelf. I took my engineering awards from the study wall, the ones Margaret had insisted on framing properly even when I thought it was unnecessary. I took my books, 2 full boxes, the ones I had already read and the ones I had been meaning to read for years. I took my fly fishing gear from the garage closet, the rod and the vest, and the old tackle box that had belonged to my father. I did not take the furniture. I did not take the artwork or the good dishes or any of the larger things that made the house look lived in. I left all of that exactly where it was. Derek and Cassie arrived at 9 in the morning, ostensibly to help. Derek carried 2 boxes to the rental van and then stood in the driveway checking his phone. Cassie moved through the house in a way that had nothing to do with helping me pack. She walked slowly from room to room with her phone raised, pausing in the kitchen, pausing in the living room, pausing at the doorway of the master bedroom. I watched her from the hallway. She was not taking casual photographs. She was taking measured ones, deliberate angles, the kind that document square footage and natural light and the condition of the floors. At one point, she held her phone at arm's length in the corner of the kitchen and swept it slowly across the full width of the wall. I recognized what she was doing because I had done it myself on job sites when I needed to document a space before renovation work began. Derek drifted back inside eventually and stood in the living room looking around with an expression that sat somewhere between nosiness and calculation. He said the place had good bones. He said the right updates would really open it up. He caught himself after that and looked at me, and I looked back at him without changing anything in my face, and he found something else to look at. Dolores Fitch appeared at the front door just before 10. She was 73 years old and had lived next door since before Derek was born, and she was not a woman who softened things unnecessarily. She stood on the front step and looked at me with an expression that was equal parts sorrow and outrage, and said in a voice low enough that only I could hear, "Elliot, you do not have to go anywhere." I told her I was all right. Then I took the spare key from my coat pocket, the one I had separated from the main ring the night before, and pressed it into her hand. I asked her to keep an eye on things for me while I was gone. She looked at the key and then looked at me and did not ask a single question, which is one of the things I have always valued most about Dolores Fitch. The drive to Meadowbrook took 35 minutes. Derek drove. Cassie sat in the passenger seat. I sat in the back among the boxes and watched the town I had lived in for most of my adult life move past the windows in the pale October light. Cassie was on her phone for most of the drive, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the angle she held it at, slightly turned away, which I suspect was meant to prevent anyone behind her from reading the screen. But the window beside her was acting as a partial mirror in the afternoon glare, and I could see enough of the reflection to make out part of a message thread. 3 words partially visible but clear enough: realtor confirmed Thursday. We arrived at Meadowbrook just after 11. Derek carried the boxes to my room without complaint. Cassie spoke warmly with a staff member at the front desk about the facility's programs and amenities. Before they left, Derek hugged me in the brief, stiff way he had developed in recent years, his hands patting my back twice before releasing. Cassie touched her cheek lightly to mine and told me with complete conviction that they would visit every Sunday without fail. They did not come that Sunday. They did not come the Sunday after that either. I had been at Meadowbrook for 11 days when my phone rang and Dolores Fitch's name appeared on the screen. I answered and she spoke without preamble because that is simply who she is. She said, "Elliot, there is a woman standing in your front yard right now, and she is putting up a for sale sign." I thanked Dolores and told her to take a photograph of the sign if she could do it without drawing attention to herself. She said she already had. She sent it to me before we finished the call, a clear image of a white and blue real estate sign staked into the lawn of my front yard, the name Vantage Realty printed across the top in neat block letters. I looked at it for a moment, then I forwarded it directly to Franklin with a single line. They didn't wait long. He replied within the hour, telling me he would have a cease and desist letter in Vantage Realty's hands by end of business the following day, and reminding me that any attempt to list, sell, or encumber the property would fail the moment a title search revealed the trust. I put the phone down on my nightstand and looked at the ceiling of my room at Meadowbrook Gardens and let out a long, slow breath. Not of relief exactly, more of confirmation. I want to be honest about those early weeks because it would be easy to tell this part of the story as though I moved into that room and immediately found my footing and felt nothing I did not intend to feel. That would not be true. The room was clean and the staff were courteous, and the facility was, by any reasonable measure, a decent place. But it was one room. The window looked out over a parking lot with a row of ornamental trees along the far edge, and the heating unit under the window ran at a frequency that took me the better part of a week to stop noticing. The hallway outside smelled of industrial cleaning products and something underneath that coffee, I think, or the memory of coffee. At night, the building settled in ways that were different from the ways my house on Deerfield Lane settled, and the difference kept me awake longer than I expected on the first several nights. What I had, though, was discipline. 40 years of early mornings and structured days do not simply dissolve because your circumstances change. By the end of the first week, I had established a routine that gave the days their shape. I was up by 6:30, dressed and walking the exterior path around the building by 7, back inside by 7:40 for coffee, and whatever the morning offered by way of reading. I was working through a book on the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge that I had owned for 11 years and never opened. I found it steadying in a way I had not anticipated. It was on one of those morning walks toward the end of my second week that I first encountered Ruth Langley. She was sitting on one of the wooden benches along the east side of the path with a paperback held up against the glare and a paper cup of coffee balanced on the armrest beside her. She looked up when I passed and said without particular preamble that the coffee from the dining room machine tasted like warm cardboard, and she had brought her own grounds from home and still could not improve it, and did. I think the problem was the water or the equipment. I told her it was almost certainly both. She nodded as though that confirmed something she had already suspected and told me her name. She was 72, a retired high school principal from outside Columbus, recently widowed. Sharp in the way that people who have spent decades managing large rooms full of unwilling participants tend to be sharp. We talked for 20 minutes that morning. By the end of the week, we had a standing chess game after dinner on Tuesdays and Thursdays, which she won more often than I did, and which she was gracious enough not to remark on directly. Victor came on a Wednesday afternoon in my third week. We walked the path around the building twice, which is just over a mile, and he talked while I listened. He had been making inquiries through people he trusted carefully and without leaving obvious traces, because that is how Victor has always operated. What he had found was this Harmon & Sons. Contracting Derek's business had been in serious financial difficulty for at least 18 months. The company carried somewhere north of $200,000 in outstanding debt across credit lines and vendor accounts. Work had been coming in inconsistently, and what work did come in was not covering the overhead. He told me that Cassie had recently submitted an application for a home equity loan of $150,000, using my house on Deerfield Lane as the collateral. The application had been denied. The reason given was that a title search had returned the property as held in trust, with no accessible equity available to an applicant outside the trust structure. I listened to all of this without interrupting. When Victor finished, I let a moment pass, and then I allowed myself a small smile. Just a brief one. Victor saw it and raised an eyebrow but did not comment. Ruth was crossing the lobby when Victor and I came back inside, and she paused and looked at me with the expression I was learning to associate with her particular kind of attention, the kind that had probably stopped generations of teenagers from getting away with things they thought they were getting away with. She said, "You are not just a retired engineer sitting quietly in a room, are you?" It was not quite a question. I told her I was exactly where I needed to be, and she studied me for another moment, before deciding apparently to accept that for now. Victor left just before 4. I walked him to his car and we shook hands in the parking lot the way we always had, and he told me to call him the moment anything changed. I said I would. I went back to my room and sat in the chair by the window and watched the light change in the ornamental trees along the far edge of the lot. My phone rang at 6:30. Franklin's name on the screen. I answered, and he said he needed to tell me something before I heard it from anyone else. That Derek had been using my name and my professional engineering license as a reference on a major commercial contract, and that the client on the other end of that contract had called his office that afternoon with questions that could not wait. Franklin did not lead with the worst of it, which I later understood was a kindness. He began with the facts he had confirmed directly, the ones with documentation behind them, and let me get my bearings on solid ground before he showed me how far the ground extended. The client was Bridgemont Construction Group, a commercial development firm based out of Columbus that had been expanding steadily into the Westfield area over the past several years. They had engaged Derek's company Harmon & Sons Contracting for a project involving the structural renovation of a mixed-use building in the downtown corridor. The contract value was $2.3 million. That number alone was enough to tell me something was wrong, because $2.3 million was significantly beyond anything Derek's company had the capacity or the track record to manage on its own, and any competent client would have known that going in. The reason Bridgemont had not pressed harder on the question of capacity was that Derek had represented to them in writing that I would be serving as senior structural consultant on the project. He had provided my professional engineering license number. He had implied, in terms carefully chosen to be suggestive, without being explicit, that my involvement was already arranged and confirmed. It was not arranged. It was not confirmed. I had not been asked. I had not been told. I did not know the project existed until Franklin said the words into the phone. I sat in the chair by my window and listened without speaking while Franklin finished laying it out. He told me that the private audit firm I had retained had cross-referenced Derek's business accounts against the timeline of the Bridgemont engagement and found that Harmon & Sons Contracting was carrying outstanding debt of approximately $210,000 across multiple credit lines and vendor accounts. The business had been bleeding money for at least 18 months. Work had come in sporadically, the margins on what did come in were thin, and the company's expenses had not been adjusted to reflect the reality of its income. Cassie's personal expenditures, which ran through a joint account she shared with Derek, included a leased vehicle she had upgraded 8 months ago, purchases from retailers that did not sell anything a person genuinely needed, and a $12,000 interior renovation of the home office she had added to their house the previous spring. Franklin read these figures to me in the same measured tone he used for everything, and I let them accumulate without comment. The plan, as he described it, had a logic to it that I found almost impressive in its construction. Move me into a care facility. Wait a reasonable interval. List the house and sell it at market value, which Vantage Realty had internally estimated at $895,000. Use the proceeds to retire the business debt, restore the credit lines, and fund the lifestyle that had been running ahead of the actual income for the better part of 2 years. My engineering reputation attached to the Bridgemont contract would generate revenue to bridge the gap while the house sale was being arranged. It was a clean structure. It would have worked if the house had not been in trust and if I had been a different kind of man. I asked Franklin one question when he finished. I asked how far back this went. He said the earliest documents the audit had recovered suggested the planning had begun at minimum 18 months ago. Possibly longer. I did the arithmetic without wanting to. 18 months ago, Margaret had been gone for 6 months. I thought about that for a moment, and then I set the thought down deliberately. The way you set down something heavy that you know you will need to pick back up but cannot carry and work at the same time. I told Franklin to file the cease and desist against Vantage Realty immediately, if he had not already done so. He confirmed it had gone out that afternoon. Then I asked him to give me the name and direct number for the appropriate contact at Bridgemont Construction Group. He gave me a name, Alan Prescott, Vice President of Project Development. Franklin asked whether I wanted him to make the call on my behalf. I told him no. This was one I needed to make myself. I dialed Alan Prescott's number from my room at Meadowbrook Gardens, sitting in the chair by the window where the ornamental trees had gone dark against the evening sky. He answered on the third ring, a careful professional voice, the kind that has learned to be neutral in situations where neutrality is the safest available option. I introduced myself. I told him my name, my license number, and my current status, which was retired. I told him that I had no consulting arrangement with Harmon & Sons, contracting that I had not been approached about any such arrangement, and that any documentation suggesting my professional involvement in the Bridgemont project was not authorized by me in any form. There was a pause on the line. Not a long one. Alan Prescott was not a man who needed long pauses to process information. He said, "Mr. Harmon, I cannot tell you how relieved I am that you called." He said his team had been finalizing the paperwork for an advance payment to Harmon & Sons, a transfer of $75,000 that had been described to them as a pre-approved mobilization disbursement signed off on by me personally. He said they would be halting that transfer immediately. He said he would need to discuss next steps with his legal team, and that depending on what that conversation produced, they might need to take this matter further. I told him I understood completely. I told him I was sorry he had been put in this position. I said I would make myself available for whatever they needed. When I ended the call, the room was very quiet around me, the kind of quiet that comes after something has been set permanently in motion. Bridgemont moved quickly. That was the first thing I learned about Alan Prescott as a professional. He did not sit on information or wait for a more convenient moment to act on it. By 8 o'clock the following morning, Harmon & Sons Contracting had been formally notified that the project engagement was suspended pending a full review of the documentation submitted during the contracting process. The advance payment had been pulled back from processing. The account it would have been wired to sat empty. Derek called me at 8:47. I know the exact time because I was sitting at the small desk in my room at Meadowbrook, writing a letter to an old colleague from the firm, and I set my pen down when I saw his name on the screen and looked at it for a moment before answering. He did not bother with a greeting. He said, "Dad, what did you do?" And then he said, "Do you have any idea what that contract meant to us?" And his voice had the particular quality of a man who is frightened and is converting the fright directly into volume because it is easier than sitting with the fear itself. I let him finish. When the line went quiet, I said, "I told them the truth, Derek. That is all I did. I told them I had no consulting arrangement with your company because I do not have one." He came back at me hard after that, said things I am not going to reproduce here in detail because they do not reflect well on either of us. And at one point he said he would find a way to override the trust, that there were legal mechanisms for exactly this kind of situation, that he would get power of attorney if he had to. I waited until he had finished that part, and then I said as evenly as I could manage, "Talk to a lawyer before you say anything else. A real one." Then call me back if you still want to talk." He hung up. I sat for a moment with the phone in my hand, and then I set it face down on the desk and went back to the letter I had been writing, though it took me several minutes to find the thread of it again. He did call a lawyer. I know this because Victor, who had ears in more places than I had ever fully appreciated, confirmed it 2 days later. The lawyer told Derek what any competent attorney would have told him, that the trust was properly structured and legally recorded, that I was demonstrably of sound mind and full legal capacity, and that there was no viable basis for a time, guardianship petition, or an involuntary power of attorney under Ohio law. The mechanisms Derek had threatened to use required evidence of cognitive impairment or incapacity. He had none because there was none to find. Cassie called me 3 days after Derek did. The difference between the two calls was considerable. Where Derek had come at me with noise, Cassie came with warmth, which I had long since learned to treat as a more demanding problem. Her voice was gentle and measured and faintly apologetic. She said she felt terrible about how things had unfolded, that there had been miscommunications on all sides, that she and Derek had only ever wanted what was best for me. She used the phrase "start fresh" twice in the same conversation. She asked if I would be open to sitting down together, just the three of us, to talk things through properly. I told her I appreciated the call and that I was open to a conversation, yes, and I kept my voice warm enough that she would hear what she needed to hear. What I was actually listening to beneath the words was the faint tremor underneath her composure. It was barely there. Most people would not have caught it. But I had spent 40 years listening to buildings tell me what they were hiding, and I recognized the sound of a structure beginning to feel its own weight. The board meeting at Meadowbrook came the following week. The facility had been managing a slow-developing problem with the load-bearing elements of the East Wing addition, and the maintenance director, a practical man named Howard, had mentioned it to me in passing during one of my morning walks. I asked to take a look. What I found was not catastrophic, but it was not nothing either, and I sketched out a remediation approach that addressed the issue without requiring the full contractor intervention the board had been quoted. Howard brought me in to present it formally. I sat at the end of a conference table in a room that smelled of old carpet and decent coffee, and I walked 7 board members through the structural logic of what I was proposing. They asked good questions. I gave them straight answers. When it was over, the chair of the board shook my hand and said they would save somewhere around $150,000 if my approach held, which I told him it would. Ruth was waiting in the hallway outside, having apparently positioned herself there at some point during the meeting. She fell into step beside me as I walked back toward my room and said without looking at me, "I want to revise what I said before." I said she was welcome to. She said, "You are not the most dangerous retiree I have ever met. You are the most dangerous person I have met in years, retired or otherwise." I told her that was probably an exaggeration. She said she did not think it was. Victor came by that Saturday and told me Dolores had reported a locksmith vehicle parked outside the house on Deerfield Lane for about 40 minutes. The locksmith had left without completing any work. The trust documents contained provisions that restricted changes to the property's access and security systems without trustee authorization, and whoever Derek had called had presumably told him as much when they looked at what they were dealing with. I was in my room that same evening when my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. I answered. A young woman's voice, careful and deliberate, as though she had rehearsed the opening Mr. Harmon, she said, "My name is Nora Whitfield. I used to work for your son. There is something you need to know about your daughter-in-law, and I did not know who else to call." I asked her how she had found my number. She said Victor Calloway's name had come up when she was trying to figure out who to contact, that she had looked him up through the state bar directory and called his office, and that he had agreed to pass along my number after speaking with her for a few minutes. I made a note to ask Victor what those few minutes had sounded like, because he did not pass things along casually. If he had given Nora Whitfield my number, he had already formed a view about whether she was worth my time. I told her I was listening. She said she would prefer to talk in person. She said she had documents with her physical copies and that she did not want to send them electronically or describe them over the phone. She asked if there was somewhere near Meadowbrook we could meet. I told her I would call her back within the hour. Then I called Victor, and he said he had been half expecting to hear from me and that he would pick me up the following morning at 9. We met Nora Whitfield at a diner on Route 40 about 4 miles from Meadowbrook. a quiet place with vinyl booths and windows that let in good morning light. She was already there when we arrived, seated in a corner booth with a cup of coffee and a manila envelope on the table in front of her. She was younger than her voice had suggested on the phone, early 30s. With the careful posture of someone who had spent years in professional environments where being underestimated was a recurring inconvenience. She shook my hand and then Victor's, and she did not do the thing some people do in tense situations, which is fill the available silence with unnecessary words. She waited until we were settled and then she began. She had been the office manager at Harmon & Sons Contracting for 2.5 years. She said she had been good at the job and had genuinely believed in what the company was trying to build, at least in the beginning. The problems, she said, had started becoming visible about 14 months into her time there, which placed them solidly within the window Franklin's audit had already identified. She noticed first that certain vendor invoices were not matching the work orders they were supposed to correspond to. Amounts were off, sometimes slightly, sometimes considerably. She flagged it twice in the ordinary course of her work and was told both times by Cassie, who handled the financial administration of the business, that it was a categorization issue and had been corrected. The corrections were not reflected in the records Nora had access to. 4 months ago, she had looked more carefully. She told me she had not been looking for anything specific, that it had started as an attempt to reconcile a discrepancy in a vendor account that was causing a problem with a project payment. What she found, instead, was a pattern. Money was moving out of the business operating account in amounts and at intervals that did not correspond to any expense category she could account for. The transfers were not large individually, ranging from several $100s to a few thousand at a time, but they were consistent, and they had been occurring for over a year. She traced as many as she could to a receiving account. The account was not a business account. It was registered to Cassandra Harmon personally. She slid the envelope across the table. Inside were printed copies of the account transfer records. She had been able to document the falsified invoices she had cross-referenced them against, and a summary she had written herself, organized by date and amount, totaling $67,000 over 13 months. Victor picked up the summary and read through it without speaking. I watched his face while he read, which told me more than the numbers did. Victor was not easily moved by the behavior of people behaving badly. He had seen too much of it over too long a career. But by the time he set the papers down, his jaw was set in a way I recognized, and he did not immediately say anything. Nora was not finished. She reached into her bag and produced a second document, a single page. It was a printed billing record from an office supply account the company maintained, but the line items on it were not office supplies. They were calendar entries pulled from a shared scheduling system she had still had access to at the time. One entry, dated approximately 6 months earlier, read, "C. Personal apt, Delaney & Associates, 2 p.m. Do not schedule conflicts." She told me she had looked up Delaney & Associates afterward. They were a family law firm in Columbus. Their practice focused primarily on divorce and asset division. I held that page for a moment. I read it twice. Cassie had been consulting a divorce attorney 6 months ago while the business was sinking, while the retirement party was still being planned, while the manila folder with its 3 adhesive flags was presumably already in preparation, somewhere. The architecture of what she had been building came into full view for the first time, and it was more complete than I had given her credit for. Stabilize the business using my house. Secure enough liquid assets to stand on her own. Then walk away from Derek with everything she had accumulated and half of whatever remained. I asked Nora why she was telling me this. She looked at me directly and said, "Because my father is 71 years old and lives alone, and if someone were doing this to him, I would want there to be a person willing to fight back. That is the whole reason." I asked if she would be willing to provide a sworn statement. She said yes without hesitation. Victor said he would arrange for her to work with Franklin's office on the documentation. She nodded and finished her coffee, and we sat together for a few minutes, in the way people sometimes sit after something significant has been placed on a table and examined and found to be exactly as serious as it appeared. On the drive back, Victor said, "Elliot, you have enough right now. You could end this today if you wanted to." I looked out the window at the flat Ohio fields moving past and thought about what ending it today would actually mean. Then I said, "Not yet. I want to give Derek a choice before any of this goes further." Victor did not argue. He drove the rest of the way without speaking, which meant he understood even if he was not entirely sure he agreed. That evening, I sat in my room for a long time after dinner. Then I picked up my phone and I called Derek's number. When he answered, his voice was guarded and tired in equal measure. I told him I was not calling to argue. I told him I would like to have lunch with him, just the two of us, and that I would appreciate it if he did not mention it to Cassie beforehand. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough for me to wonder what was moving through it. Then, he said he would be there. I chose a restaurant on the quieter end of Merchant Street, the kind of place with booths along the wall and enough ambient noise to give a conversation privacy without requiring you to raise your voice. I arrived 20 minutes early and took a corner booth near the back and ordered coffee and sat with it untouched, while I thought about what I intended to say and more carefully what I intended not to say. Derek came in 7 minutes late. I watched him move through the restaurant toward me, and I noticed things I had not let myself look at directly in a long time. He was thinner than he had been 2 years ago. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there at Margaret's funeral. He moved with the particular kind of tension that settles into a person's shoulders when they have been carrying something heavy for long enough that they have forgotten what it feels like to put it down. He saw me looking and arranged his expression into something neutral before he reached the booth, and he slid in across from me and picked up the menu and studied it for a moment, even though I could see he was not reading it. I did not open with the folder or the audit or Bridgemont or any of it. That was not what this lunch was for, not at the start. I opened instead with a Tuesday morning in March, 33 years ago, when Derek was 10 years old and had fallen from the oak tree in the backyard of the house on Deerfield Lane while trying to retrieve a kite that had come down in the upper branches. He had broken his left arm in 2 places. I had driven him to the hospital, with his arm held against his chest and his face white and absolutely silent, because Derek at 10 years old was the kind of child who went quiet when he was frightened rather than loud. I had sat in a plastic chair in the waiting area for 3.5 hours while they set the bone and applied the cast, and I had not once considered going home or sleeping or doing anything other than being there when he came back, through the door. I had never told him how long I sat there. It had not seemed like something that needed to be said. He looked at me across the table while I told it. Something shifted in his face, not dramatically, just a slight loosening around the eyes. He set the menu down. I told him what I knew. Not all of it, because I had made a deliberate decision about how much ground to cover, but enough. I told him about the Vantage Realty listing that had appeared on my front lawn 11 days into my time at Meadowbrook. I told him about the home equity loan application that had been submitted using my property as collateral and rejected because the title search revealed the trust. I told him about Bridgemont Construction and the representation that had been made to them in writing about my professional involvement in the project. I laid each item out without theatrics, the way I had always presented. Structural findings: here is what the data shows. Here is what it means. Here is why it matters. He denied things at first, not convincingly. The denials came out already shaped like retreats, and they lost ground with each exchange until they stopped coming altogether, and he was just sitting across from me with his hands flat on the table and his eyes somewhere in the middle. Distance. I reached into the jacket pocket beside me and placed a folded sheet of paper on the table between us. He looked at it without picking it up. It was a printout of the partial text thread I had read in Cassie's phone reflection during the drive to Meadowbrook, the one that referenced the realtor confirming the Thursday showing. Behind it was a copy of the rejected equity loan application with his signature on the co-applicant line. The silence that followed was the longest of the meal. A server came and went without either of us acknowledging her. Derek said finally, in a voice that had gone quiet, "She said it was temporary. She said we would pay you back before you ever knew it had happened. She said it would work." I looked at my son across that table, and I asked him the only question that had been waiting behind everything else for the better part of a year. I said, "Derek, look at me. When did you stop being your own man?" He did not answer right away. What happened instead was that his face did something I had not seen it do since he was very young. Since the hospital and the plastic chair and the cast they put on the arm he broke in the oak tree. His eyes filled. He pressed his lips together hard and looked down at the table and breathed carefully for a moment. And then he told me the truth, or the part of the truth he had access to. which was that the business had been failing for longer than he wanted to admit, that he had felt like a failure for most of the past 2 years, that Cassie had told him this was the only path that worked, and he had been too tired and too frightened to think of another one, and that he had made himself believe it, because believing it was easier than the alternative. I listened to all of it. When he finished, I did not reach across the table, and I did not tell him it was all right, because it was not all right, and he deserved the truth of that as much as anything else. What I did was look at him steadily and tell him that there was more, considerably more, that I had not shared today, and that what happened next depended entirely on the choices he made in the days ahead. I told him I needed a week. I told him to use it. He nodded. He did not ask what more meant, which told me he already suspected, at least in part, that the edges of what he knew did not represent the full shape of what had been done. We finished lunch without saying much else. He paid the check, which surprised me, and we walked out to the parking lot and stood for a moment in the pale autumn light before going to our separate cars. He looked like a man who had set something down and was not certain yet whether he felt better or worse for the lightness of it. 6 days went by without a word. I did not call him. I had said what needed to be said, and the next movement was his to make. On the morning of the 7th day, I was sitting at the desk in my room at Meadowbrook, working through the last chapters of the Brooklyn Bridge book, when my phone rang. I looked at the screen. It was not Derek's name that appeared there. It was Cassie's. And when I answered, the voice on the other end was not the measured, carefully warm voice I had grown accustomed to over 6 years. It was something else entirely. Something with the warmth completely removed. She spoke before I had finished raising the phone to my ear. She said she knew I had been talking to people, and she wanted me to understand that whatever I thought I was doing, I was not as far ahead as I believed I was. The warmth she had carried through 6 years of Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings and carefully managed conversations was entirely absent. What was underneath it was precise and cold and considerably less pleasant, and I found to my own mild surprise that I preferred it. A person who has finally stopped pretending is at least easier to read accurately. I did not say anything immediately. I let her continue, which she did. She said she knew about Nora Whitfield. She said whatever Nora had told me was fabricated by a disgruntled former employee with a personal grievance that Nora had been let go for cause and had made threats at the time of her dismissal, and that any documentation she claimed to have was either falsified or taken out of context. She said this fluently, without hesitation, in the tone of someone reciting a position they have already prepared and refined. Then she shifted, and the shift was the part I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it. She said that older men who chose not to cooperate with their families in matters of health and care sometimes found themselves in complicated situations. She did not elaborate on what complicated situations meant. She did not need to. She said there were processes available to concerned family members when they believed a loved one was no longer capable of making sound decisions independently. She said she hoped it would not come to that she genuinely hoped we could resolve things between ourselves, but that she needed me to understand all of the options that existed. I was recording the call. Ohio is a one-party consent state, which Franklin had confirmed for me early in our work together, precisely because he is the kind of attorney who thinks several steps ahead of the immediate situation. I had a small application on my phone that I had set running the moment I saw Cassie's name on the screen before I answered. It captured everything from the first word she said before I had fully raised the phone, and it was still running, while I kept my voice completely level and told her I appreciated her concern, that I understood she and Derek had been under considerable pressure lately, and that I hoped we could all find a way through this that worked for everyone. I said it warmly. I meant none of it, and she could not tell the difference, which was important. She ended the call herself, which told me she had said what she had called to say and considered the purpose accomplished. I sat for a moment in my chair by the window, and then I opened the application and confirmed the recording was complete and clean, and I sent the audio file to Franklin with a message that said only she called this morning. Listen to all of it. He called me back within 40 minutes. He said, "Elliot, this is a gift." He said what I had sent him constituted on its face a credible case of witness intimidation and elder financial abuse threat, captured in the subject's own voice, time-stamped, and obtained in full compliance with Ohio law. He said he would be adding it to the file he had been building and that it materially changed the weight of what we were holding. 2 days later, Nora called me. Her voice had a quality in it I had not heard before, a tightness that told me something had happened before she said a word about what it was. She told me Cassie had come to her apartment building, had not come inside but had stood in the lobby and spoken to her when she was coming in from an errand, long enough to make clear that she knew where Nora lived and that the professional references Nora was relying on for her next position could be made unreliable if Nora continued to involve herself in matters that were not her concern. Nora said she was not panicking, but she was shaken, and she wanted me to know directly rather than hear it secondhand. I told her to sit tight and that I would call her back within the hour. Then I called Franklin and told him what had happened, and he said he would have one of the attorneys in his firm contact Nora that same afternoon to provide formal legal representation and document the encounter while the details were still fresh. He said what Cassie had done was its own separate problem, now distinct from the financial matters, and that it had a name under Ohio law that carried its own consequences. Ruth found me on the walking path later that afternoon. She matched my pace without being asked and walked beside me for a full circuit of the building before she said anything. Then she said, "Whatever it is you are doing, I hope the people on the other end of it deserve what is coming." I told her I believed they had made their own choices. She nodded at that. She said, "You have been in command mode for 2 weeks. I can tell because you stopped looking at the trees." I had not realized I had stopped. I made a point of looking at them, then the ornamental row along the far edge of the parking lot bare now in the late October cold. I told her something I had not said aloud to anyone. They handed me the pen. I said, "I am just writing the ending." She looked at me for a moment with that particular steadiness of hers, and then she said, "Then write it well. Do not rush it." Franklin called that evening just after 7. He said he had spent the afternoon in consultation with his colleagues and that he was calling to tell me that a formal complaint had been filed that afternoon with the Ohio Attorney General's office, specifically with the division that handled financial exploitation of elderly adults. He said he also needed to tell me that the county district attorney's office had reached out to him directly. They had questions, he said, and they wanted to talk. The district attorney's office sent 2 people to Franklin's office on a Thursday morning, and I sat across from them at the conference table and answered every question they asked with the same precision I would have brought to a deposition or a technical review, which is to say, completely, and in the correct order and without embellishment. They were thorough, which I respected. They had already done considerable background work before sitting down with me. And the questions they asked were not the questions of people who needed to be convinced that something had happened. They were the questions of people who were deciding how to characterize what had already happened and who was most responsible for which part of it. The matters they were focused on fell into 2 broad categories. The first was the Bridgemont situation, which, from a prosecutorial standpoint, had a clean shape to it. A licensed professional's credentials had been used without authorization to secure a commercial contract worth $2.3 million, and a disbursement of $75,000 had nearly been transferred on the basis of that fraudulent representation before I had intervened. Under Ohio law and potentially federal statute, this touched on fraud in the inducement and unauthorized use of professional licensure, and the federal wire fraud angle existed because the contract documents had been transmitted electronically across state lines. The second category was the financial exploitation complaint filed with the Attorney General's office, which covered the attempted use of my property as loan collateral, the pattern of pressure designed to separate me from my assets, and the recorded phone call in which Cassie had made what Franklin's team characterized as an implicit threat against my legal capacity. I told them what I knew about both matters. I gave them the documentation Franklin had assembled. I provided the audio file. I answered questions about the timeline and the sequence of decisions with as much specificity as I could. And at 2 points in the conversation, I said the same thing clearly, and on the record, Derek Harmon had participated in the Bridgemont misrepresentation, but the plan had been designed and directed by Cassandra Harmon. Derek was not innocent, but he was not the architect. I wanted that distinction to exist in whatever record they were building because it was accurate, and because accuracy has always mattered to me more than convenience. Franklin walked them out when we were finished, and when he came back into the conference room he told me Derek had called his office twice that week, leaving messages both times, asking to speak with someone. Franklin said he had not returned the calls because Derek was not his client and the situation was active, but he wanted me to know. I told him I appreciated it. I sat with that information on the drive back to Meadowbrook and thought about what it meant that Derek had been trying to reach someone and had not been able to reach me directly. It meant he was moving towards something. I did not yet know what. Dolores called on a Friday afternoon with news of a different kind. She said there was a small truck outside the house on Deerfield Lane, backed up to the side door, and two men she did not recognize had been carrying boxes out of the garage and what appeared to be items from the back of the house. She said it had been going on for about 40 minutes when she called me. She said one of the boxes had what looked like the corner of a picture frame sticking out of the top. I called the non-emergency police line while I was still on with Dolores, which required me to put her on hold and manage 2 calls at once, something I had not done in years but managed adequately. I filed a property report, gave them the address and my name and my status as sole trustee of the Harmon Family Revocable Trust, and described what was being removed from a property I owned and controlled. A patrol car arrived at the house within 20 minutes, according to Dolores, who watched the entire proceeding from her front window with what I gathered was considerable satisfaction. Franklin had a formal letter in transit to Derek and Cassie's address before the end of the business day. Every item was returned within 48 hours, including the picture frame, which turned out to be one of my engineering awards, the largest one, the one Margaret had insisted on hanging in the entryway where visitors could see it. The board at Meadowbrook sent a letter that same week confirming that my proposed structural remediation plan for the East Wing had been approved and would be implemented at the start of the following month. The letter noted that the approach would save the facility approximately $150,000 compared to the outside contractor estimate they had received. Howard, the maintenance director, stopped me in the hallway to shake my hand. Ruth, who seemed to be informed of most things that happened in the building within a reasonable interval, found me afterward and said, "Kept the building." She paused and added, "I find that almost annoyingly competent. Victor came on a Sunday and we walked the path in the cold November air, and he told me he had never in 40 years of friendship seen me fight anything the way I was fighting this. I asked him what he meant by that. He said quietly, he said most people when they are wronged in the way you have been wronged either collapse or explode. He said I had done neither. I told him I had just followed the plans. He said that was exactly what he meant. I was reading after dinner that same evening when the front desk called my room and said there was a visitor in the lobby who had not called ahead. A man. He had given his name as Derek Harmon. She said he looked like he had not slept in several days and had asked if I was available, and she wanted to check before sending him back. I told her to send him back. I set my book face down on the desk and sat for a moment in the particular stillness that comes before something you have been expecting arrives at last. Then I heard his footsteps in the hallway slower than his usual pace, and I stood up from the chair and opened the door before he could knock. He looked worse than I had anticipated. Not dramatically so, not the kind of deterioration that announces itself, but the kind that accumulates quietly over days when a person has not been sleeping or eating with any consistency and has been spending a great deal of time inside their own head, with thoughts that do not improve with repetition. He was wearing a jacket I recognized from years ago, one he had owned before Cassie, before the business, before any of this. I noticed that without knowing quite what to do with the noticing. I brought him to the common room at the end of the hall, rather than my room, because the common room had 2 chairs that faced each other with enough space between them to breathe, and I thought we would both need that. It was empty at that hour. The television in the corner was off. Through the far window, the parking lot was dark except for the lights along the edge, and the ornamental trees stood in a row beyond them, stripped bare now by November. He sat down and did not speak for a moment. He looked at his hands in his lap. Then he told me he had found something. He said he had been going through the shared file storage on their home computer looking for a document related to the business that he needed for a meeting with his accountant, and he had found a folder he had not known existed. Inside it were 2 things. The first was a set of statements from a bank account he had not known about, registered in Cassie's name alone, showing a running balance that had been accumulating for over a year. The second was a billing record from a law firm in Columbus, Delaney and Associates, showing 3 paid consultations over a 6-month period, the most recent of which was 9 weeks ago. He said he had looked up Delaney and Associates. He said it took him about 4 minutes to understand what kind of law they practiced. I sat across from him and let him talk. I did not tell him I already knew about the account or the law firm or what their practice areas were. That was not what this moment required. What it required was for him to say the things he had come to say in the order he needed to say them without me managing the direction of it. He said she was going to leave me. She was planning it while we were still doing all of this. She was using both of us, Dad. She was using me to get to you, and she was building a door out the whole time she was doing it. He said it with a flatness that told me the shock had already passed by the time he drove here, that what was left was something harder and quieter than shock. He said he had not slept properly in 4 days. He said he had called Franklin's office twice and had not heard back, and had not known who else to call, because most of the people he might have called were people Cassie had introduced him to or cultivated in some way, and he was no longer confident about which relationships were genuinely his. I let a silence sit for a moment after he finished. Then I asked him the question I had been carrying since the evening of the retirement party, the one I had not asked at the restaurant on Merchant Street because the time had not been right. I said, "Did you clap, Derek?" He looked at me. He knew exactly what I meant. He did not pretend otherwise. He said, "Yes, sir." I did. I said, "Why?" He said, "Because she told me it was the right thing, and because I was too afraid to think for myself, and because it was easier to believe her than to ask you what you actually wanted." I looked at my son for a long moment. He was 38 years old, and he was sitting in a chair in a senior living facility common room at 9 o'clock on a November night, because the life he had built around someone else's blueprint had come apart at every joint simultaneously, and what was left was just him without the structure, which is sometimes when you can finally see what a person is actually made of. What I saw was not a villain. I had never quite been able to make him into one, even when it would have been simpler. What I saw was a man who had been weak when he should have been strong, and who had known it the whole time, and who was going to have to live with that knowledge for considerably longer than this conversation. I did not tell him it was all right. I did not embrace him. What I did was reach into the breast pocket of my jacket and take out a business card I had placed there before he arrived, because I had known in the way you know things you have been quietly waiting for, that this visit was coming. Eventually. I set the card on the cushion beside him. I told him the name on it was an attorney, not mine, his. Someone who could represent his interests independently and help him get ahead of what was moving toward him, rather than waiting for it to arrive. I told him to call in the morning. I told him to tell this attorney everything, including the parts that reflected badly on himself, because those were the parts that would matter most. I told him to cooperate fully with the investigators and to do it before he was asked, rather than after, because the difference between those two things was significant under the law and also under any other measure worth applying. He picked up the card and held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he asked me if I could forgive him. I told him I was still listening to him, and that was where we were for now, and that it was more than he had given me. When he sat across from me at the patio table on the evening of my retirement party and brought his hands together like the decision was already made and already fine, he nodded. He understood what I meant. He left just before 10. I walked him to the lobby and watched him go out through the front door and across the parking lot to his car. I stood at the glass for a moment after his headlights had gone, and then I went back to my room and sat in the chair by the window and did not read. 3 days later, Franklin called to tell me that Cassie had been formally interviewed by investigators from the Attorney General's office that morning. The interview had lasted 2.5 hours. He said the investigators had left with what he described as a very complete picture. That same afternoon, he said Cassandra Harmon had filed for divorce. The divorce filing did not surprise me. What surprised me mildly was the timing the same afternoon as the Attorney General's interview, which suggested that whatever had been said in that room had accelerated a decision Cassie had already been moving toward. She had always been someone who preferred to control the terms of an exit rather than be shown one, and filing first, even in circumstances like these, was consistent with how she operated. She would have calculated that initiating the divorce put her in a more favorable posture, that it signaled agency rather than retreat. What she had not calculated, or had miscalculated significantly, was what the marital estate actually consisted of at the moment she filed. Franklin walked me through it 2 days later, with the methodical patience he brought to everything. The business accounts for Harmon & Sons Contracting had been flagged by investigators and placed under a preservation order, which meant that no funds could be moved or dispersed from them while the fraud review was active. The accounts were not frozen in the sense that the business had been seized, but they were effectively immovable for the duration of the investigation. This meant that the primary asset Derek might have contributed to a divorce settlement was inaccessible. The secondary assets, the joint accounts, he shared with Cassie, the checking and the household savings, carried balances that reflected 2 years of spending that had consistently outrun income. There was not a great deal there to divide. Cassie's private account, the one Nora had identified and the audit had documented, had been flagged separately by the Attorney General's investigators as potentially comprising fraudulent proceeds. A hold had been placed on it pending the outcome of the financial exploitation review. The $67,000 she had been accumulating for over a year, the money she had been building her exit on, was effectively unreachable for now and possibly permanently, depending on how the legal proceedings resolved. The vehicle she drove had been leased, not purchased, and the lease payments had fallen 3 months behind. The leasing company moved on it with the efficiency that leasing companies typically bring to delinquent accounts, and the car was recovered on a Tuesday morning from the driveway of the house she and Derek had been sharing. Dolores, who had become something of an informal correspondent on matters relating to properties in the area, sent me a text message that afternoon with 2 sentences: "The BMW is gone and I thought you should know." The home equity line that Cassie had planned to draw against the one she had applied for, using my house on Deerfield Lane as collateral, had never been accessible. The trust had closed that door before she had finished designing the approach to it. What remained when you set the inaccessible assets to one side and looked at what was actually available was primarily debt. The marital estate, as a practical matter, was a liability rather than an asset, and the divorce Cassie had filed to protect her position had walked her directly into that reality with no obvious way back out. Her initial divorce attorney withdrew from the representation within 3 weeks of the filing. I do not know the specific reasons, because those matters are private, but Franklin noted that the timing coincided with the attorney receiving a complete picture of the ongoing investigations and that it was not uncommon for legal counsel to reassess when the scope of a client's exposure became fully visible. The attorney who replaced him had a more transactional approach to the situation and advised Cassie, according to what eventually became part of the formal record, that her most viable path was cooperation with investigators in exchange for consideration on the charges being developed against Herzais. The district attorney's office, in consultation with the Attorney General's division, had settled on a set of charges that included conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse, attempted fraud related to the Bridgemont misrepresentation, and a related count tied to the attempted use of protected property as loan collateral. Derek's attorney, the one whose card I had placed beside him in the common room at Meadowbrook, had moved quickly. Derek had cooperated fully with investigators within the week following our conversation, providing his own account of the planning and execution of the scheme and making clear in terms that the investigators found credible that the direction and design of it had originated with Cassie. Bridgemont Construction Group received a formal acknowledgement of the misrepresentation and a commitment of restitution, and the district attorney offered Derek an arrangement, a structured restitution plan, a period of probation and mandatory counseling in exchange for full and continued cooperation. His attorney advised him to accept. He accepted. Vantage Realty, the firm that had agreed to list my property without conducting adequate due diligence on whether the seller had authority to list it, received a second formal communication from Franklin that outlined in precise and unfriendly terms their potential exposure for participating in the Davenley attempted sale of a trust-protected asset. The agent who had staked the sign in my front lawn was no longer with the firm by the end of the month. I did not take particular satisfaction in that. I did not take particular satisfaction in most of what was unfolding, which is something I think people who have not been through a situation like this sometimes find hard to understand. Ruth found me on the walking path one morning, in the 3rd week of all this, and kept pace beside me without speaking for about a quarter mile. Then she said, "You look like someone who has won something they did not actually want to win." I told her she was not entirely wrong. She said, "That is because you never wanted to destroy them." You just wanted to stop being destroyed. I thought about that for the rest of the walk and did not find anything in it to disagree with. 6 weeks after Cassie filed for divorce, a letter arrived at the Meadowbrook front desk, hand-delivered by a courier addressed to me by name. The return address was a law office in Columbus. Inside was a single page on firm letterhead, brief and formally worded, requesting a meeting at my earliest convenience on behalf of Cassandra Harmon to discuss a potential resolution of the outstanding matters between us. I took the letter to Franklin that afternoon and set it on his desk and watched him read it twice before he said anything. The proposal it contained was structured in the way that proposals from people in weakened positions often are framed, as mutual benefit, written in the language of resolution designed to look like a reasonable compromise while actually being a last attempt to limit damage that had already been done. Cassie would withdraw all remaining claims against Derek's business assets in the divorce proceeding and provide a signed, notarized statement fully detailing her role in the financial scheme, including the attempted use of my property, the funds she had directed out of the business, and the fraudulent Bridgemont documentation. In exchange, I would withdraw my participation in the Attorney General's Elder financial abuse complaint and provide a written statement to that office, indicating that I did not wish to pursue the matter further. Franklin set the letter down and looked at me across the desk with the expression of a man who has been in enough rooms with enough proposals to understand exactly what one is worth without needing to spend much time on it. He said it was my decision and that he would support whatever I chose to do. He said that as a purely practical matter, Cassie's signed confession would be a significant document regardless of what I did about the AG complaint, and that the district attorney's case had its own momentum at this point and was not entirely dependent on my continued participation in the parallel complaint. He said the offer was not nothing. He also did not say it was something. I asked for 20. He said to take whatever I needed. I walked the path around the building 3 times that evening, which is approximately 3 miles more than my usual circuit. The November air had a particular quality to it that I have always found useful for thinking the kind of cold that clarifies without punishing. I thought about what accepting the offer would mean in practical terms, and then I thought about what it would mean in the terms that sit below practicality, the ones that tend to outlast legal proceedings and financial settlements and all the other structures people build to manage the aftermath of things that should not have happened. I called Victor from the far end of the path, standing under the bare ornamental trees in the dark. I told him what the letter said. He listened without speaking until I had finished, and then he asked me one question. He said, "What would Margaret say?" I was quiet for a moment. Not because I did not know the answer, but because knowing it and saying it out loud are different things, and the second one has a weight that deserves a moment of preparation. Margaret had watched me work for 4 decades. She had seen me on job sites and in boardrooms and at kitchen tables covered with blueprints, and she had understood, in the way that people who pay close attention understand, what I believed about the relationship between the way you build something and how long it stands. She had told me once during a disagreement about a shortcut a contractor was proposing on a public project that I was the only person she had ever met who treated corners as a moral category. It was not entirely a compliment the way she said it, but she had smiled after. What she would have said was this: "Elliot Harmon, you have never cut a corner on a foundation in your life. Do not start because it would be convenient." I called Franklin from the parking lot on my way back in and told him I would not be accepting the proposal. I told him the AG case should continue on its own terms. He said he understood and that he would notify Cassie's attorney in the morning. Then I told him one other thing. I said that when he next spoke with the district attorney's office, I wanted it on the record that I was formally requesting they consider Cassie's full and genuine cooperation as a mitigating factor in whatever outcome they reached. Franklin paused for just a moment before he said, "May I ask why?" I told him it was not for her benefit. It was because the system worked the way it worked, and if cooperation was supposed to matter, then it should matter consistently. And that was the kind of thing I could either believe in or not believe in, and I had decided some time ago which one I was. Cassie cooperated. I do not know what her reasons were, whether it was the practical reality of her position or something else, and I did not spend a great deal of time trying to determine it. What she provided to investigators was thorough and detailed, and it did what Derek's attorney had been working toward it, established with her own words and her own signature that the planning and direction of the scheme had been hers. The charges against Derek were reduced to the terms of the agreement he had already accepted. Cassie's outcome, when it came, included a substantial fine, 18 months of probation, with reporting requirements, 200 hours of community service, and a permanent record that would follow her in ways the fine alone never could. The divorce was finalized in the same week. She left the marriage with the debt that had always been there, and almost nothing else. Because there was almost nothing else to take. She did not reach out to me after. I had not expected her to, and I did not find the silence difficult. Some conclusions are complete enough that they do not require a final word from anyone. I had been at Meadowbrook for 3 months and 4 days when I came back from the morning walk to find the small red indicator on my phone that meant I had a voicemail. I pressed play and stood in the hallway outside my room and listened. It was Derek. His voice was unsteady in the way that voices become when a person has been holding something for a long time and has finally stopped trying to hold it. He said he needed to talk to me. He said he needed to apologize properly. Not the way he had done it in the common room, but completely without leaving anything out. And then he said the thing that I had not let myself wonder about until I heard him say it. He asked if there was any part of me that might consider letting him come back. He did not specify what coming back meant. I think he was not entirely sure himself. He just asked, in that unsteady voice, and then the message ended. I listened to the voicemail 3 times. Not because I had not heard it clearly the first time, but because there are messages that require more than one pass before you can be certain you are hearing what is actually there, and not what you have been bracing for or hoping for, or some combination of both. By the 3rd time, I was fairly confident I understood what Derek was asking, which was not a specific thing so much as a direction back towards something, without knowing yet what the path looked like or whether the ground would hold. I called him the following morning and told him to come when he was ready. He arrived that same afternoon. This visit was different from the one in November in ways I noticed from the moment he came through the front doors of Meadowbrook. He was not wearing the old jacket this time. He was dressed plainly and practically the way a man dresses when he is not trying to present a version of himself, but simply to show up as whatever he actually is. He had shaved. He stood in the lobby and waited for me to come to him rather than moving toward me, which was itself a kind of answer to a question I had not quite asked. We went to the garden on the south side of the building, a small enclosed space with a stone path and 2 benches, and a pair of dormant rose bushes that in warmer months were apparently quite something according to Ruth, who had opinions about the garden that she shared readily. It was cold, and the sky was the flat gray of a December that has not decided yet whether it intends to snow. We sat on the same bench, close enough to speak quietly. He apologized. He did it the way he had said he would in the voicemail, completely, without leaving things out, without the partial accountability that is sometimes worse than no accountability at all, because it shapes the apology around the parts that are easiest to admit. He apologized for the retirement party. He apologized for the folder and for the pen that Cassie slid across the table, and for the fact that he had been there when it happened and had done nothing to stop it, and in fact had made it worse with a single motion of his hands that he said he had thought about every day since. He apologized for the years before that, the gradual withdrawal, the way he had allowed someone else's priorities to replace his own until he was not recognizable to himself in the ways that mattered. He said he was in counseling now, had been for 6 weeks, and that some of what he was learning about himself was not comfortable to learn, but that he intended to keep going regardless. When he finished, the garden was quiet. A bird moved in one of the bare bushes along the stone wall and then was gone. He said, "I know you don't owe me anything. I know you don't have to do this, but I would like to try to be your son again, if there is any part of you that is open to that." He said it simply without theater, the way a man speaks when he has run out of anything to hide behind. I thought about something I had told engineering students years ago when I occasionally lectured at the university on structural assessment. I had told them that when a structure has been compromised, the first question is not whether to tear it down, but whether the foundation is still sound. A compromised foundation means you start over, but a sound foundation with damaged elements above it is a different problem entirely. That one you approach with reinforcement, not demolition. The question is always the foundation. I told Derek I was not prepared to return to the way things had been. That was not on the table, and would not be. What was on the table was something that had to be built differently with different materials and a different understanding of what each of us was responsible for maintaining. I told him he would continue with the counseling not because I was requiring it, but because a man who stops before he is finished is a man who has not yet decided to finish. I told him the business needed to operate legitimately and transparently, or it needed to close, and that either outcome was acceptable, but the middle ground he had been occupying was not. I told him he would have no role in my finances, my estate, my property, or any decision related to any of those things, not now and not in the future, and that this was not a negotiating position. He said he understood. I believed him. Then I told him to get his coat. He looked at me. I told him we were taking a drive. We drove to Deerfield Lane without speaking much. I directed him to park in the driveway the way we always had, and we got out, and I used my key, and we went inside. I walked through the house slowly the way I had walked it thousands of times before, the entryway, and the hallway, and the kitchen with the window above the sink that faced the backyard oak tree, and the living room where the afternoon light came through at an angle that I had never seen duplicated anywhere else. Derek followed a few steps behind, saying nothing, letting me take the time I needed with each room. I stopped in the kitchen. I stood there for a long moment. Then I turned to my son and said, "I am coming home." He put his hand over his mouth and stood very still for a moment. Then he sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs and covered his face and did not try to stop what happened next. I let him have the moment. Then I said quietly, because it needed to be said and would not need to be said again, "If you ever bring your hands together like that at something that hurts someone you love, you will remember this day and you will know exactly what it cost." He nodded without looking up. He knew. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. A text from Victor, which was unusual for that hour. It said, "Elliot, I think you need to know Cassie has been trying to reach Nora again. Check your email when you can." I checked the email before we left the kitchen. Victor had forwarded a message Nora had sent him after receiving it herself, because she had learned by then to route anything from Cassie through people who knew what to do with it. The message was long, considerably longer than anything the situation required, and it had the quality of something written at an hour when judgment is reduced and the need to speak overwhelms the wisdom of staying quiet. Cassie had directed it at Nora personally, and it covered in terms that were by turns bitter and accusatory and occasionally incoherent the full range of grievances she had accumulated over the preceding months. She blamed Nora. She blamed Derek. She spent 2 substantial paragraphs on me. She said things about each of us that reflected considerably more about where she was than about where any of us had actually been. I read it once and forwarded it directly to Franklin with a note asking him to determine whether it constituted a violation of Cassie's probation conditions, specifically the provisions related to contact with individuals connected to the case. He responded before I had put the phone back in my pocket. He said he had already seen it, that Nora had sent it to him simultaneously, and that he would be forwarding it to Cassie's probation officer first thing in the morning with a formal notification. He said the terms of her probation were specific on this point, and that she had apparently chosen for reasons that were her own to test them. I showed Derek none of this. He was still sitting at the kitchen table, composed again, watching me with the careful attention of a man who has decided to pay closer attention to things than he previously has. I put the phone away and told him it was handled and that we should go. He did not ask what was handled. He trusted that I would tell him what he needed to know when he needed to know it, which was itself a change from the posture he had carried into most of our conversations over the past several years. What Cassie's message ultimately produced beyond the probation review that followed was a kind of conclusion, not the dramatic variety, not the kind that arrives with a confrontation or a final accounting in a room where everyone is present. The quieter kind, where a person makes one last movement that confirms everything that has already been established, and then there is simply nothing left to add. After the probation officer reviewed the communication and issued a formal warning that would remain in her file, Cassie went silent. No further messages came to Nora or to anyone connected to me. She moved out of Ohio within 2 months, according to what little information filtered back through sources I was not actively cultivating. I did not look for more than that. She had been a significant presence in my life for 6 years, and then she was not, and the space where she had been filled, gradually and without ceremony, with things of more substance. Moving day back to Deerfield Lane fell on a Saturday in the second week of December, which gave the morning a particular quality of light, the low winter sun coming in at a long angle across everything and making ordinary objects look more considered than they usually did. Derek arrived at 7:30, 2 hours before anyone else, and when I came through the front door with the first load from the car, I found the house already opened up, the windows cracked to let the stale air out, a pot of coffee running in the kitchen, and the floors swept clean throughout. He had not been asked to do any of it. He was on his hands and knees in the hallway when I walked in, wiping down the baseboard along the wall, and he looked up and said good morning and went back to what he was doing. Ruth arrived at 9:30 with the 2 friends she had made me learn the names of over the preceding months, insisting that people who helped you move deserved to be known by name and not referred to as a group. She brought a coffee cake she had made herself, which she set on the kitchen counter, with the authority of someone who has decided that this is where the coffee cake goes and that the matter is settled. Dolores came across from next door before 10. Eyes bright and voice carrying from the driveway, and she took one look at the activity in and out of the front door and immediately assumed a supervisory role that no one had offered her and that everyone was glad she had taken. Victor stood in the backyard for most of the morning near the oak tree, drinking coffee and not helping with anything and not apologizing for it, which I found genuinely comforting. At one point, I went out and stood beside him, and we watched Derek carry a bookcase up the front steps with the careful competence of a man who builds things for a living when he is operating honestly, and we did not say anything to each other. Because 40 years of friendship produces a fluency in silence that is worth more than most conversations. In the early afternoon, when the rooms had begun to look like themselves again, I went to the bedroom and took Margaret's photograph from the bag where I had carried it across these months and placed it back on the nightstand where it had always been. I stood with it for a moment before I set it down. This woman who had spent 31 years in these rooms and who was present in every corner of them in ways that had nothing to do with furniture or photographs. I had started a scholarship in her name at the community college, the paperwork finalized the previous week, the first awards to be given in the spring semester to students studying engineering and the applied sciences. It was not a monument. It was more like a continuation, which was what she would have preferred. That evening, after everyone had gone, I carried a cup of coffee out to the back porch and sat in the chair I had sat in on 1,000 evenings before this one, facing the yard where the oak tree stood bare against the darkening sky. The cold was clean and direct and honest, the way December cold tends to be in Ohio when it is not trying to be anything other than what it is. My phone rang. Ruth's name on the screen. I answered, and she said, without preamble because she had never seen the point of them well, "How does it feel?" I looked out at the yard, at the tree at the last of the light along the top of the fence line, and I told her it felt like standing on a foundation I had built myself. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said that was a good answer and that she expected she would see me Tuesday for chess and that she intended to win. I told her she probably would. She said she definitely would, and then she said goodnight and the line went quiet. I sat on the porch for a long time after that, in the dark and the cold, with the coffee going warm and then cool in my hands the way Margaret's always had. I had signed their paper with my own hand on my own patio on the evening they had chosen to believe was the end of something. What they had not understood, and what I had known from the moment I set the pen down and pushed the folder back across the table, was that the signature was not a surrender. It was the first line of a different document, entirely one I had already begun writing in an office across town 8 months before they ever opened that folder. A man who has spent his life understanding how things hold together knows that the most important work is never the part people see. It is the part beneath the part that bears the weight quietly and without announcement. The part that determines whether everything above it stands or falls. I had built that foundation carefully, and I had built it alone, and I had built it to last. And on a cold December evening in Westfield, Ohio, sitting on the back porch of the house on Deerfield Lane, I was still standing on it. And that is where we leave Elliot Harmon, sitting on his back porch, in the December cold, on the foundation he built quietly and alone, while everyone around him assumed the game was already over. I want to take a moment before we close to share what this story means to me personally, because I think it deserves more than just an ending. What moved me most was not the legal victory or the collapse scheme, or even the moment they came crawling back. It was the silence. The way Elliot picked up that pen without a single word of protest and signed his name with complete dignity because he already knew something they did not. That kind of composure does not come from anger. It comes from knowing exactly who you are and refusing to let anyone else write that definition for you. The lesson I take from this is not about revenge. It is about preparation, patience, and the quiet courage it takes to protect yourself before the threat arrives at your door. If you are in a season of life where you feel overlooked or underestimated by the people closest to you, please hear this document everything. Trust your instincts. Speak to a professional you chose yourself, and never sign anything without understanding exactly what you are signing and what you already have in place. And if someone hands you a pen and expects you to disappear quietly, remember Elliot. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is pick up that pen, sign your name, look them in the eye, and let them wonder what you already know. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. It means more than you know.